What's up, Trekkies? It's your boy Will Wofford here with Trekker's Delight, a Star Trek-inspired podcast. Before we get started, we're going to give away $100, so make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to our channel where we will announce the lucky winner every single week. Now, welcome to Trekker's Delight.
Today, thank you. How are you doing, man?
We're doing good, man. How are you, buddy? How is it over there on the other side of the world?
It's really good. It's nice. Always spring, as I like to say, until it gets to be scorching summer. But it's really great. I'm really enjoying the weather. It's like winding down in school, so things are really good. How are things where you are, Chicago?
Pretty good. It's turning into spring around this time of the year, so
Nice.
Change and new things, and everything's good.
That's good. That's good. I'm glad.
Yeah.
So we come back together today to discuss, and we're going to get to the episode later. We have Will and Marie joining us later. We're going to talk about the episode DS9, In the Pale Moonlight. And in that episode, very briefly, we're going to talk about how Sisko has this personal log, and he talks about all of the manipulations and machinations that he did in order to bring the Romulans into the war, because he was just sick of posting casualty lists on every Friday. So just briefly, Mo, if you could just encapsulate kind of like how you felt when you watched this episode. I'm not sure how I felt yet. I'm still sort of processing, but I'm interested in how you felt.
Well, I joked around with you. I think that I felt nauseous and sick a couple of times.
Yeah.
When the episode started, that was all before the opening credits. So
that's right. You did say that.
It was, certainly a good episode. I'll give it that much. In both in the longer stretch of the storyline and also as an isolated story.
Yeah.
But it's also one that deals with, I think, heavy themes, especially when put up or juxtaposed against kind of what's going on currently in the real world, or
interesting,
in real time. In terms of the rules of war and conflict in times of desperation that can lead us morally astray, or at least put morality on hold. So it's my initial reaction to the episode is it's timely in the sense that you can look at it as a slice to make us talk about some real world issues, and also revealing, as I like to always point out, these instances of how the Federation doesn't really function differently from any other type of system, but somehow point for the good guys, as I think.
I mean, I never claimed that it had some kind of exceptionalism or that it required some special status as an organization. I just thought it was an enlightened organization. So it just, of course, it's framed that way as well. And now that you bring it towards like the real world, like, and how we sort of think about war and the greater utopias that human beings are kind of going to. I mean, can you tell me of another narrative, any other other narrative, like really that shows us like a future utopia? I think that as a lot of Trekkies or Trekkers or whatever, I always hated that nonsense of, is it a Trekkie, is it a Trekker? Oh, your Star Trek should look like this, your Star Trek should look like that, whatever nonsense. Is there any other like narrative out there that you would say like that human beings are like striving for, and in any fantastical way? Like you'd be like, this is some kind of fiction that like inspires you and is like something that you'd be like, not just, I mean, for me it is Star Trek, for me it's the Federation, for me that is the narrative that like sort of inspires and allows me to see like some kind of future. But is there any other narrative that you've come across that would be comparable?
I mean, I think it shares the same thing with all other utopias, right? Whether it's articulated through the Star Trek model, or I'm trying to think here, what would be a...
It's a tough question, I know. Like, you recently read Foundations, I think.
Yeah, yes, but Foundations doesn't appeal to the same kind of normative structures that Star Trek goes for. There's always been a moral underpinning in Star Trek that there is a better world, and that better world would have X, Y, and Z features. And I always understand what you're saying in terms of it's morally progressive. It moves towards values that are inherently have some goodness to them. But I think it's also has a giant lacuna and just this giant gulf of blind spot that it's um, doesn't consider in its articulation of its values, and that's where I think I always push back is that um, you reach a point where the articulation of the system is like, well, if you don't accept this, then somehow you're on the wrong side,
Interesting.
right? And that's what this episode I think does really well. I mean, you even see Cisco at one point refer to himself as the good guys, right?
Yes.
Towards the end of the episode.
So true.
And so I don't think I've answered your question because I haven't given you an example, but
that's fine.
It's the same.
It's okay not to be able to.
It's the same critique of any utopia, right? It's still an envisionment of someone's conception of the good, and that's going to inherently just come into conflict with other conceptions that don't share that same normative system, or at least even the foundations of that system, right? That's true. Then it becomes just human values imposing themselves on other structures that might not share that. And Star Trek in general has a good way of using different aliens, different groups to articulate different characteristics of human nature, right?
Yeah.
They're all still a reflection of humanity in some sense, whether it's the logical end of it, or right, yeah. Because we can't think beyond that, right? And
it's really difficult.
It's still, right, and I get it, of course, right? But we anticipate that they're going to always have the same appeal to the same kind of again, it's just, to me, it's just a fiction. It's just that they're going to appeal to the same kind of moral underpinnings, that they're going to be also concerned with conceptions of justice or truth or goodness or rightness. And that's where I think, again, of course, there are universalists about these things, that there are these universal values that aren't constrained by space and time and are not specific to a species, but are actual properties of the universe, right? And that anyone can find them, the same way we can think of gravity. There are moral, objective particles, so to speak, out there. Or we are just a unique being that brings these values into the universe. And they're important and we care about them. I'm not saying don't be moral, morality only goes so far, but these are superimposed onto the world, right, by us. And
I agree.
Yeah. Well, let's just stop imposing it on, other groups that we meet that might not share our earthly quadrant system values. Yeah, that's all. I guess I like to think bigger than you Trekkies.
I mean, bigger than the Trek world. Yeah. I remember an argument that we had when we were in university. It was in the later part of your doctorate. I think you were still kind of at York. And there was this hullabaloo where Neil deGrasse Tyson had come out and said that philosophy, he angered a bunch of philosophers and came out and said, like, philosophy is useless. There's nothing in, like, nature. Nature is infinitely more majestic than anything you can philosophize about. And I was really incensed by that because I really looked up to Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Bill Nye also echoed the same thing. I'm like, you clowns, like, how did you, like, your conceptions of, like, a better world are useless because we already live in this grand, like, universe, and it's bigger than anything you can possibly think about. And I just thought that was a really arrogant statement. I remember thinking, we read some articles together, I remember thinking to myself, like, without a moral compass like Star Trek, and again, like, we're manifesting our world every day, and I would never have thought, like, the world that we currently live in is the one that I would have lived in when I was young. Like, it's like it's so different than, like, what we thought when we were kids. So I just wanted to compare this idea that, like, these scientists and philosophers who try to conceive of, like, a better reality or whatever, I still hold in regard a utopia like Star Trek in a higher realm, simply because it's a guiding moral force. I can still believe in something and not live up to it, And so this is at the root why I love Star Trek, is that it's something that I sort of strive for. But I wanted to know where you landed on the idea of, like, the philosophy, the schism in that sense, and how you place Star Trek in that firmament.
Well, I certainly think it's normative, right? It's giving you those norms that you strive for, and thinking that a better world will be one that's governed and functions in that way. And I think that's part of what's beautiful about normative theorizing, right? And what even sci-fi writers do is that they give us a world that we use as a comparative stick to the world that we actually live in, right? So a world in which we have, institutions that promote equality, however way we define equality. And obviously there's massive disagreement about what's the best form of equality or the right form of equality. But we think institutions that fulfill those kinds of ends are normatively better than ones that mistreat people, right, or discriminate based on random characteristics like skin color or religious beliefs or whatever. In that sense, I've always appreciated Star Trek because it does inform at least one set of institutions that if we can reach, the world could maybe be a better place, and that becomes the norm that you use to evaluate whether we're doing well or not. On the other end, I worry that it just falls prey to its own use, by which I mean it falls prey to becoming a normative system that if we don't achieve, we're somehow lacking. So it's a pendulum that swings for me like both ways. On one end, there's this greatness to it, a world that things look like that and function like that strikes me as being more desirable. Then other times I worry that that's not a shared conception. That is a utopia, just a utopia given my circumstances. I don't know. That's kind of the way I've always kind of approached all issues, I guess. Star Trek just. I don't know why it becomes a target.
Is it because it's dear to me?
Maybe, yeah. Because I think ever since I met you, it was always you always put it on this pedestal in some sense. And I think I've always been like, yeah, but
I get it.
have you thought about the limitations of imposing that kind of world order, or at least wanting that kind of world? And I think, like I said, I've always respected Deep Space Nine because it felt like to me, out of all of them, the first one to take the criticisms more seriously, or at least there was a time in which the criticisms couldn't be ignored. And that's part of an intelligent TV show that is evolving and becoming self-aware of how it functions within these ideas. And so I think it's great. And this episode itself has always been, one that it's a blurry episode, right? It's a lot of moral ambiguity. Makes you wonder what's right and what's wrong, and how Cisco sees things. And you can see the fatigue of war on it too, right? It's a desperate man who's willing to do things if it means it will bring about the end of suffering, I guess, or what he sees are weekly casualties.
I mean, there is a military sense to it. Like, even though Starfleet wasn't conceived as a military, it is militaristic in DS9. You get a war, you have command, people die, there's casualty lists, and then that's what kicks this off is the audacity of war. And back to your inclusivity point from the last episode that we did, where it's like, if you draw a circle around what you think of as being an inclusive thing, then you necessarily exclude,
right?
And then you have yourself in the other. And he just the audacity of Cisco, I think that makes him both great and different than any other captain, is that in this episode you explore the fact that he is the man who started the war with the Dominion because he drew a line. And he how a gun in Good Omens, there's a great quote. He's like, a gun in the right hands puts weight to a moral argument. But what I really wanted to ask was, and I don't know if you remember this episode. I think it was called Time Zero or something like that. But it's the episode where Picard goes back in time to the 1800s and finds data in the Old West, and Guinan is there, and she's been there, she's young or whatever, and they find Samuel Clemens, and he's on their trail and stuff like that. And so Samuel Clemens somehow gets on the Enterprise, and he's in a turbo lift with Deanna Troi, and they're talking about the way the world works, and she's like, war, disease, famine, all that stuff is gone. He's like, he's talking about cigars. She's like, you shouldn't smoke. He's like, whatever, this is you guys don't smoke? He's like, no. She's like, we got rid of a lot of things. We got rid of war, disease, famine. And she's like, young lady, the world where I come from is built on the shoulders of men to power other men and whatever. It's this terrible, horrible thing that just grinds out on people. He's like, and you're telling me that isn't the way it is anymore? And she's like, no.
Right.
And he looks at her and he looks at his cigar and he's like, maybe it's worth giving up cigars.
Well,
You know?
it's right. And I know they made several references to the disgusting habit of cigarette smoking. That was like a 21st century kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
But I don't know if though. I mean, yes, getting rid of. I don't know. There's something boring about a world that doesn't have those things. Now that's
I
not
agree.
cruel, and I don't want to obviously say that. I wish
I get it.
Famine, but
It's honest.
it's kind of this criticism that, like, yeah, you don't want. Part of what motivates human spirit, and what part of animates it, is passion and drive. Doesn't mean that there's still no passion and drive in the world that lacks any of these things, but tragedy, trauma, all these things are part of like a wider range of experiences that humans have. And again, this is not to articulate that I favor, bad things happening, but they're part of what animates us artistically and creatively and emotionally and socially. And to him, initially hearing that all these things have been removed strikes me as also, and I have to go back and watch the episode in the context, but
It's okay.
as that it is there. There's something missing in that world. There's it doesn't appeal to him, and I could see that. I could see the point.
As an evolutionary biologist, I think that like we've built systems on top of systems, and might equals right was sort of the thing until you had civilizations, and then you had higher economics that sort of dictated the goods that are produced and how they're distributed, and you had whole new systems of politics and philosophy that sort of dictated how human beings coexisted with one another. I think it's really difficult to embrace a philosophy for some people that is so alien and foreign, where the idea of the economic system that we're used to, and Picard said this in First Contact, right? He's like, we no longer use money, for these reasons. We've evolved beyond it. It was such an arrogant statement, but I loved it. I loved it that he said, well, we've evolved beyond you. Like we're at this whole thing. Whereas I think that in their time, there are a lot of great snatches in Star Trek where they're reduced back to human beings, like they're hungry or they're in jail or something, and you see them as being as like raw animalistic men again. They're always reduced to that, like to that state again. And so what I would say is that I think it's difficult to picture the philosophy of Star Trek working on our current systems, simply because it's difficult for us to conceive of a system where human beings aren't cruel to each other passively, not actively. I think there are active systems of cruelty, but in our everyday life, there are like passive ways in which we are like stuff is anyway.
Lost you there for a second, but I've got the general point. Yeah. Well, because there's always in the world, there's always going to be competing interests, and that doesn't go away. And competing interests will often, I'm thinking of a quote here by Ghazali about how the sharpest thing on earth is the tongue, because it divides us. Language.
That's so good.
This notion that there's always going to be competing interests, and when interests align, there's always going to be, or not always, but when interests aligns, you'll get your cooperation. But when interests conflict, then we engage typically in violence, right? As a method. And look, for another day, we can talk about the whole notion of what is violence, how can we justify violence, and is there a justification for the use of violence to bring about change or to bring about certain consequences. But I think this episode in particular just shows that when interests are competing, in this case, Cisco's and Dominion, because of the way the war is going, he tries to bring other people into cooperating with him by getting them to be in the same vulnerable circumstances and so come to share the same interests. But the way he goes about it, again, we still have a lot to unpack there. But to get back to your general point, I think it still gets back to this notion that as long as there are competing interests and that human beings see another human being as competing over the same resource or competing over the same shared interests, then to be, I guess, a bit Hobbesian about it, we'll always be in a somewhat state of war against each other. Of course, we can enter a civilized social contract and find ways to distribute goods without having to hurt each other, blah blah blah. But these things don't always hold up. Competing interests, and I think we're seeing it in the world right now, right? I mean, you have a person on one side of the world who has an interest, and whether it's rational or irrational, whether it's and he's carrying out that interest, and of course it's and there are other states who have a competing interest with that interest, including the state that's involved with the whole thing, or is the one that's under attack right now. But you're just seeing a conflict of interest where leading to, I think, just aggression and violence in order to secure those interests.
I feel like, but we do have the technology now. We don't just we have proof of concept that the world could change. I'm not saying it would change overnight, but in the next 10 years, drastically. It is possible. It's not probable, but it's totally, and it would change the nature of all of these conflicts. Now, it would destabilize what we would call the status quo since World War II, which is the idea of like the Non-Proliferation Act, the nuclear biological chemical treaties, the idea of like computer sophistication, relegating and distribution of goods and services, and how people, like, we're already seeing a disruption in, like with COVID, like the disruption of like the work week. I have a 4-day work week now.
Right.
And we're seeing how like digital services are changing, like having kids at home. Like, we really realized, I think, during COVID that like the world won't stop if we don't shop for things.
Right.
What really stopped was like if anyone can picture what life was like before COVID, you often told me, like, do you remember what September 10th was like?
Right.
I remember you telling me that, like, as a quote, like, what is it like the day before, like, some huge event? Like, do we even remember what things were like before COVID?
Right.
It was economic wasteland. And
it's definitely motivated change. It's become a catalyst in its own way. And we do recognize that we could do things differently and still be, proficient and effective and stuff.
Yeah.
And it scares me that, to get change like that, it takes these like global like events, that shakes a whole tree rather than just shakes little branches of it. Fair enough. I mean, okay. So the disruption and the COVID and stuff has shown us that we have the ability to technologically evolve the world to meet a different kind of, work standards and social functions. Continue. I guess maybe I just lost.
It's morally unacceptable. It's morally unacceptable for me that nation states don't turn inward to their goods and distribution services and change the dynamic of how their countries work. To like, some of them are very slowly changing the way they are, but like the way we use energy and consume it. Like, why do we still have brick and mortar stores? It's dumb.
Right.
I don't get it.
Competing interests, right?
Like, we need green space. Like,
right.
Yeah.
But again, it comes back to human conceptions of and interests. And I don't know.
So this is where my Star Trek and Federation love come from. Is like, for the betterment of if human. When I was a kid, and really like living in the Star Trek world, that I wanted to like be that kid. I thought that human beings were driven, that their intent was driven by nobler ideas. And I don't want to give up that nobility. Like, I do live in the real world. I'm not naive.
Right. But I agree with you.
I don't want to.
What you're asking people to do is to lay down to find that cooperative reasons that are more stable than just let's get through the next little bit together, right? It's that you're asking for a fundamental change in which we just have different sentiments towards each other. And I worry that we built also for the last, 200 years, built a world in which kind of individualism also and the conception of me. I don't want to generalize, obviously, there are competing conceptions and there are many communal conceptions of the good, has also kind of, given rise to this world in which it's even more difficult to bring people about to shed their own individual interests. And,
it's true.
But I get that. I mean, that's in Star Trek as well, right? That kind of nobler, the many are greater than the one, and so on.
Yeah.
and maybe we are morally evolving towards that way, or at least progressing towards something in which we, but the problem with morality is up and down. It can
I
progress,
agree.
it can go
The bent
backwards.
of the universe, right?
Yeah,
It's
right. It's like right now, I am optimistic that the sentiments towards war are different for the newer generation. The younger people are less tolerant of, I want to say less tolerant, but are even the sentiment is even stronger against them. I mean, so they were also there in the hippie era in the 60s and 70s, but there's this like strong wave of sentiments against the war, against war in general. You know, um, so not in our lifetime, but hopefully there's a changing of the tide where we do move towards
yeah.
cooperative ends that are actually better for everyone,
It
rather
seems like we
than
live in a world of villains, and like, all we're missing is like super powered, I think there's a reason that we're in the Marvel world, in a DC world. Like, we really are, and that's why Star Trek is boring to people. Like,
sure.
I don't get it. Like,
It
it's
absolutely
not.
maps. I think it maps on our fantasies.
Yeah,
Absolutely, cinema, and I also obviously they're a reflection of the economy and the drive behind it. But they also, I think, the stories that we tell are often a reflection of the human imagination and creativity and reflection in reflecting its own circumstances. And we
yeah.
are kind of obsessed with these big scale events. You know,
Hmm.
today more than we've ever been concerned with them. Right? It's not the fights are less local and they're more global. And
Yeah,
there's this kind of cinema reflects that. You see a lot of films that try to touch on these sentiments that are supposed to be shared, about global issues and not strictly just strictly local. But we're out of our depth there. I think to bring it back to Star Trek, um, I'm not even sure I would bring that back specifically to Star Trek, but
again,
um,
I think that the conception of like a utopia in today's
yeah,
world
yeah. Sorry,
is
yeah.
quaint. No, it's okay.
And no, and the beautiful thing about the episode is that it invokes that kind of moral thinking about what are you willing to do to create a better world, and can we sacrifice a few for the many, and so on and so forth. These questions aren't going to go away. I don't care what century you're in.
There's a great quote. I'm going to get into the summary of like, all it cost was the life of one programmer, the life of
Right,
one corrupt senator, and the self-respect of one Federation
right,
officer.
right. That was the price it cost in order to save man. He acknowledges that he's okay with that. That's probably the scariest thing at the end, is that um, he could do something, he did it, and he's okay with it, despite knowing it's greater ramifications if it was to.
Again, that's the trolley problem. We often see this. Like, what is action versus inaction?
Well,
Like,
that's what I love about it. The moral questions that you find in Star Trek are dressed up in different garb in a different century, but they're the exact same questions you find in Plato's Republic.
yes,
And that's always been to me what keeps us in conversation with the past, and the present and the future will be in conversation with us, right? Like, you've probably heard me hammer this too many times, but there will be a time when imagining that there are universities or some kind of educational institutions 4 centuries from now, they will talk about the 21st century in a bubble, in terms of where we were at this point, what our
yeah,
beliefs were, how we
yeah,
dressed,
yeah,
why we believed what we believed, who the greatest scientist was up until this point, what the decisive war was, up until this point,
yeah.
Um, and sometimes you have to stop and understand that we don't have the answers. What we have is
Oh,
the next set of offered answers to the same questions, and hopefully an advancement or a build on, the former sages who have come. But sages leave advice for you to follow up until a point in which you think you can carve your own way. Right? We're not here to be bound by the hand of the past, but it's to guide us and tell us to kind of find our own wisdom in our own time. But
yes,
it always reminds me that no matter how advanced we think we are now, we are still going to be talked about the same way we talk about the Shakespearean era and how plays were done, in the back of horses and carriages, and how, you know, what were the plague of the time that really informed his writing, and so on and so forth. We're just going to be another point in history in which mankind will talk about its expression in the 21st century. Um, and that always keeps it local for me in some ways as well. Like, it's
yeah,
our interpretation of everything, but these questions, there'll be different answers to them in the coming years.
Yes, I mean
And that's
things will
beautiful.
fall.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's
that's
a
fine.
beautiful thing. It's not it shouldn't stagnate. It shouldn't stop. Yeah.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
I just wish. I think that in a way, I'm anxious or I'm impatient to see the development of like this amazing new world that maybe I'll never get to see or whatever. Where you know, I think you took me one time to see a philosopher, a Mac Etienne Balibar, and I've never
Oh
been able
yeah,
to
of
like see
course.
him.
Yeah.
Remember that? Like
Oh yeah, that's
the
great.
I've never forgotten that talk. It was fantastic. Where this man who came and said there should be no borders, so there should be no countries.
Sure. Yeah. Us and
Why do you
them. Yeah.
it's one blue dot. Like we should all be one people. It makes no sense. And morphologically, we may look differently, but like in terms of genetics, we were incredibly inbred and incredibly related to one another. So they're divisions that we've created for ourselves, and in order for us to survive or to take over
Right.
different parts of the ecology, we've evolved to a point. I mean, I hate to say that, but we've evolved to a point where we're totally like aware
Right.
of each other. It's weird how like in touch we are with each other, and how much of an ability we have for informational services to know like what's happening in the smallest tribe somewhere in the world, and yet we lack connection. We lack the empathy of like realizing that these larger sweeping nationalistic like ideals are actually like hampering and hindering the individual. And so I would come back again, like to bring it back to the Federation,
Yeah.
which is a unifying force, like in Star Trek. It's bringing together. Because if you watch Enterprise, it's the pre-Federation days or whatever. It was a series of treaties or trusts or bonds between species who realized that they had more in common. They had
Right.
figured out the conflicts of their worlds and gone out into the and they real it's almost like the naval tradition. You're like, okay, well, you have this navy, I have this navy. We're not going to fight each other, and then maybe we'll trade some spices, whatever. And through these slow economic like things, we'll build bridges to each other. Then realize we have more in common than we have misgivings of each other.
Right.
But
that's the foundations of the utopia, right? That you reach that point in which the self-interests are overridden by these shared interests that propel us towards a greater good that actually improves a lot. And that's what you need. Maybe it's a smaller working population. Maybe it's after a massive event, that shakes the earth to a point in which we realize that we are better together than fighting each other.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, yes, we've developed these signifiers that we use to draw distinctions, including territorial boundaries, right? Even Europe, Europe is constructed in a way to separate itself from the non-European, but where those boundaries are, who's actually Asian and who's European, I mean, but again, these constructs also matter to us. I don't deny that. I'm not like, oh, look, they're all hypothetical. I always remember this one scene from the movie Blow with Johnny Depp, where he gives like this judge this speech about like, he's like, yeah, but I broke a bunch of hypothetical lines, and did a bunch of, and then the judge is like, well, this is a real court and this is a real gavel and like this is a real law that you broke, so you're going to jail. They're real to us. Of course, they're real to us. They're not just social constructs. They affect our everyday life. But I wish also, going back to Etienne Balibar talk, is that we can conceive of ourselves without these boundaries. And see the shared interest as extending rather than being, Ukraine's interest end here or Germany's interest end there. And hopefully we will. That these will be relics of the past in some ways, that we don't think of ourselves as that divided, and rather see it as one big blue ball, so to speak.
I think there's this worship, almost like this cult of, Ayn Rand, Fountainhead sort of like ideal of like capitalism, where, the free market forces will fix things or whatever. Everyone's riding the markets and so forth. And like really, I mean, we want to eat the millionaires and the billionaires and, do the whole Bernie Sanders thing. While we're all arguing philosophy, real people are dying. That's my point, is like,
of course,
until we make that,
and
there's a
Cisco's
cognitive
point
dissonance.
Too.
That's true. That's exactly right. And then while you guys are all
we have the luxury of thinking these things through, but in real time and in real circumstances, with the luxury of thinking through the problem might not be there always, especially in times of war. And that's what Cisco is pressed with, right? It's not like he has the luxury of spending another year and seeing what happens when the list every week. But I don't want to also be so dichotomous. Like, we can also do both. We can have moments where we have to act fast, but then also have people working on the long-term solutions to these things. But yeah,
die at the age of 60.
The episode itself, I want to bring it back to a few points there. So you and I can chat about many things and go many places. I'd say a lot of positive things about the episode. The episode also, of course, worries me in terms of the way morality becomes disruptive for Cisco. Rather than guiding his actions, it becomes something that's impeding his actions or his desires to bring about circumstances to get.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, I have actually a handful of good points. I believe they're good points, or at least have points. You can tell me how good they are when you hear them.
I love
it. But in this episode, he treats morality as getting in the way of what he needs to do, and so he wants to suspend it. It's disruptive. Rather than being normative, rather than being prescriptive and guiding his actions, he sees morality as constraining his actions, and not allowing him to, do what he thinks is necessary to turn the tide of the war, or at least, to bring about a victory for the good guys. I thought that was very interesting in the episode. So I saw. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that, or at least in this episode, you never get a sense of Cisco's definition of peace. He just wants there to not be any more violence in the sense of like casualties and people dying. That kind of definition is, when I was watching the episode, it's the kind of definition that's worrisome, because if you define peace as simply the absence of violence or the absence of conflict, then the desert becomes a peaceful place. That is to say,
a lack of life.
A lack of life would actually be peaceful. I don't think that's the kind of peace he wants. Right. He never understands peace as, to kind of borrow something from one philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead. Peace is a type of harmony, right? It's being in harmony with one's environment, or being in harmony in one's relationships that generate a sense of peace. Something that you find in other doctrines as well. I'm just drawing on the one that I'm thinking of. You start to overstep the boundaries of morality, and you start to do things to achieve a certain peace. But then why stop there, right? That's the scary thing about the episode, is once you've suspended morality and taken a step over the line, what's the difference between taking one step versus 100 steps? And you might say, well, there's a certain sense of degrees, doing one bad thing to make things better, but then why stop there, right? If you could take 50 more steps to make things even better and better. And so once, it's kind of a dichotomous thing. Once you get over that boundary, is it more offensive if he does more things in the near future to bring about an even faster desirable result, right? That's the tension he gets caught up in. I think that scares me, is what's to stop him from doing other things if they're to achieve the exact same goal. Makes you wonder how many other deleted logs there are in Cisco.
That's a good point.
Right, that you win. Of course, he ends the episode with, "I can do something, so I did it," which is just fallacious from a philosophical standpoint. Just because you can do something, nothing implies that you ought to. It's kind of a fundamental idea in morality. You can't derive an ought from a can, right? So at the end, yes, there's a lot of things he can do, including sleep well at night, knowing he did this, but nothing implies that he should do those things. Those were some things, I don't know, man, it came to my mind that I still think about. And I'll say one last thing about the ending of the episode, because we find out at the end that there was simultaneously another plot going on, right, that ends up resolving the whole thing. right for him. Garrick was plants the bomb or whatever and produces the desired result. I wish the episode had not ended that way. I wish that there was an explosion that happened that killed that ambassador, whoever it was that they had targeted. But I wish it had purely happened out of pure moral luck. That is to say, the episode still ends with him getting his outcome, but as a reminder that there's always this element that no one has any control over. It's pure moral chance that something can go that can produce. So in this case, to me, an explosion on that ship that would have killed that person, that would have happened by virtue of being an accident, while he still has this, recording with him that links the Dominion to plotting an attack and so on and so forth. But just to show you that there's also this element in war, that there are some things that are completely out of our control. And so Sisko's desire to be able to control the circumstances would have been, I think, even nicer to end with something like showing that, but there's this one element you can't control for, and that's just pure moral luck. On this circumstance, it happened to go your way. But things can change that quickly. And it could be out of no effort of any particular agent. Just the universe that we live in happens to coincidentally produce an outcome that happens to be favorable to the Federation, but was never intended by anyone.
And my friend, I'm going to leave it there. We'll shoot the second part of this now. I really enjoyed that conversation. It's a great run-up to actually dissecting the summary, which we'll get into next.
Yes.
Thank you for your input on that. I just need time to think about what you just said. Like, the idea that, again, I will disagree, and we'll bring it up in the next bit here and say, like, of course. And so what I'll leave you with is that idea that, like, Sisko ultimately, unlike a lot of other Starfleet captains in this episode, makes a choice that he will claim is for the greater good, but ultimately realizes it's for his own good. And I think that is diametrically opposite to a lot of other Star Trek captains in the way that they rationalize the way that they make decision making. And I love that dichotomy, and I really want to explore that with you. So I just want to say thanks again, man, for being here.
Thank you, Barry.
For being so wrong.
Great to have me.
Yes, it really is. So I'm just gonna count it out, and honestly, thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next bit. Take care. Bye.
Now again, I'm gonna say this again because we're near the end of our show. If you are our allies, we are not talking to you. We are not talking to you. This does not. Okay, we're not talking to you. Stop trying to take our and make it your business. It ain't got nothing to do with you. It ain't got nothing to do with you.
Our experience of grief independently.
Bruh.
Yes.
I love that they're in the comments.
So much is like, I'm just reading the comments.
Yeah. They should run their child. That's such a good point, Will. God, that's such a good point. And he's really thought about it too. You should be here. William, get over here.
I thought he had a girlfriend on Insta. It's been ages since I've mucked about, but.
Okay, moving on. Let's move on.
We gotta move on.